Hello everyone and welcome to your Niagara Falls experience, episode 23.
I got the wrong one.
That escalated quickly. But in all seriousness, folks, as always, I am Nico, the American, as you can tell by the giant American flag hovering next to me. I'm joined here by Peter, the Canadian.
Hey, how's it going? Waving free, huh? True North. Loving it.
Yes, absolutely. And you may be wondering, well, Nico, why are you dressed like a captain? And the reason is we're talking about boats.
Nico, why are you dressed like a captain? Someone should ask.
Someone should, I guess. Yes, we have to technically ask that question. Right. Yes, we're talking about boats today.
Ooh, yes.
We feel like it's a perfect time. The Maid of the Mist did start for its season Saturday.
Yes.
It was very busy. I was down in the park. It was very busy.
And you noticed, like, the Canadian boats, we were out like a month before that.
Yeah.
See, we're not afraid of ice or snow or stuff. But, yeah, you guys had a power outage, too. Too bad. Yeah, that just leaves you speechless. Canada again. Let's hear it for Canada.
Hey, moron!
Wrong one again.
No, that one was right. That was right.
Okay, I'll take that one. Hey, how's everyone doing? I know we got Angela. Oh, hang on. When that happens, it means I've opened up our show on one of the platforms and forgotten to mute it. That was my fault, eh? So, yeah, what did we watch tonight, Nico? We watched, before the show, we were watching some of that Bob and Doug, Mackenzie brothers.
Yep.
And, well, tonight, though, has to do with the water side of Niagara Falls, because it's kind of something I've worked on for about 20 years. I've had a program called Because of the Falls. And what it is a series of things that exist in Niagara that involve Niagara Falls as the reason why they happened. One of them being the Erie Canal and the other one being the Welland Canal, the two canals that bypass Niagara to allow shipping to the upper Great Lakes. And I found out last year, Nico, that you have a passion for the old classic steamships, one in particular that gives you that sinking feeling.
Yeah, and, that one.
I mean, you live the part. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into being so big a fan of the old steamships? Because you've shown me watches and whistles and hats and you name it.
So it's actually it's a weird story. So in 1997. The film Titanic came out. I was, let's see, not even 2 yet. I would have turned 1 in 96, so I would have been turning 2 in 97. So when that film came out, I was about to turn 2 years old. So by the time it got onto HBO a year later, I was 2 years old and was able to watch it. Why a 2-year-old was watching Titanic, we will never know. The court is on. I will say it was not at my mother's house. We will give credit where credit is due. But I was obsessed, and I really took a liking to sinking ships. And then that developed into an obsession with the Titanic. I'm what we would call a Titanorac, which is a Titanic nerd, is the other phrase for it. But I have seen like when I was about 5 or 6, I saw the first Titanic exhibition with all the artifacts when it came to Cleveland. That was before they split it up. Since they split it up, I have seen it in Columbus. I have seen it in Rochester. I have seen it in Florida twice, most recently about a month ago. I went to the Titanic experience in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, like 3 days in a row. I own the first, second, and third class China. I have right in here is a Titanic mate's whistle made by Acme Thunder. They're still made in England the same way they were over 111 years ago. The White Star Line logo is on the top of this lovely hat. But I'm not just obsessed with White Star Line, other than it is my favorite. Obviously, the Titanic is kind of I would say my favorite. It's actually my second favorite, and we're going to explain why later on in the show.
Yes.
And I'm going to talk about my 2 actual favorites. But Titanic holds like a deep place in my heart, and the movie also does. It's my favorite film. There's a quote in the film Titanic for just about any situation, as I have learned.
Yeah, here's one for Maid of the Mist.
Yes, what you see. Iceberg, right ahead!
Now you see that's funny because there was high water yesterday.
Yep, the Maid of the Mist suffered high water from a release of water by the Power Authority, right? That's what usually leads to it. You're quite knowledgeable on this. And their dock was underwater. A part of it was rendering it unable to board passengers. So I had a group yesterday afternoon, and they had to reschedule till this morning. So today would have been my day off, but I went out at 9 this morning and met everybody because they were just nice people, you know?
It's also because Peter's a nice guy, so it makes sense.
No, never.
But yes, I will say, unlike the Titanic, the Maid of the Mist has never had a major incident, so we don't do that. Like, they've never had that kind of major incident. There was the time, other than the time in the 50s where on the dock the 2 original wooden boats did burn. That I wouldn't even consider, that was more of a dock issue. They don't do that. This was before the days of fire safety.
Right.
In fact, like, if we had a lot of people like, well, why can't we have the Titanic today? And we can't have the Titanic today because it's not even remotely up to fire code. One of the main reasons the Queen Mary stopped sailing was it was not up to fire code.
My mother came over on the Queen Mary from England at the end of World War II. That was her favorite boat.
It's beautiful. One of my goals in life is to go see the Queen Mary out in California, especially if it keeps changing hands. Its future's a little bit uncertain right now.
Yeah.
Like, I gotta get on planes that I don't like doing to go get on that boat. But it's really cool, and that boat was built by Cunard, which was a competitor of White Star, and eventually in the 1930s bought White Star. So
I did not know that.
Yeah, that's actually where, so for a while it was Cunard White Star. And then eventually they dropped White Star out of their name.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, because we wonder where those companies had gone over the years, and you know, because the world changed. I mean, went from steam engines to diesel, eventually to nuclear power or some naval ships. But and the reason why we got onto this is that in one of my past careers, I worked for the St. Lawrence, I worked for a ferry service that went across Lake Ontario. And I think I was telling you, Nico, that back in 1997, the year we launched service, in early June of that year, we had James Cameron, the director of Titanic, and his Titanic team, so to speak. They weren't large people, but they came aboard, and we did a catered trip across the lake for them, which was rather appropriate given that he was being given an award for his accomplishments as a director in his hometown of Chippewa, which is on the Canadian side, just south of Niagara Falls. So that's that was my first sort of brush with Titanic and him. I even played that song Southampton on the ship's PA system as we left the dock.
Oh.
Dun, 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 and it was really cool. But that career I undertook back around 1995, I started working for the ferry service, researching ferry services all over Ontario, ended up working with a lot of people on the Great Lakes and traveling the Great Lakes on their ships. So I became a real student of Great Lakes shipping and the history and lore that goes with it. I mean, we all know the Edmund Fitzgerald. You wouldn't believe the number of other wrecks there have been, but that's the one Gordon Lightfoot made so famous. And as a passionate student of that, as I moved away from PR and into tourism, I started doing I did tours of the Welland Canal. I do a bunch of specialty tours, and this was part of the Because of the Fall series. And I would take people up and down the Welland Canal, various viewing points. We'd go to the St. Catharines Museum, and I'll show that to you in our presentation video in a minute. But that's how I got into it. In fact, on August 19th, 1998, I was in a boating accident. One of the ships that we ran was a hydrofoil, and we got taken out by a 7-foot wave through the windshield and rescued by the Coast Guard. And we had major government leaders from Ontario with us coming down to St. Catharines for a meeting. And it was really a horrible incident. Like, it was really scary. And because this whole thing filled with water, but it never dampens your spirit, you know. Now, have I seen an iceberg? And I'll show you I've seen them. I probably would have been a lot more afraid. But by the way, hi to Angela. Angela Hunt, now working with Niagara Falls Tickets, 5-Star Niagara Falls, and Niagara Regional Tours. Angela is an amazing host at Niagara Falls, as we have so many great ones. We got to get Caleb on here.
We could, yeah.
We've got to bring Caleb. We've got to bring...
We have a lot. We have a lot of people. That's kind of, the fun part about this show is that we can, like...
do what we want.
We could do... what was that about neutral ground, you say?
Well, I was talking to Roland today. He's with one of the companies. He'd love to come on, and he's got a great story of what he did in his life. So I told him maybe next week we'll get Roland on.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
And then, like, a few upcoming weeks, like, we've been talking to a lot of, like, tour guides and people that work in the area that want to come and, like, either watch the show or they just want to come tell their stories and share their experience. And that's what we do here. We share experiences. So it's really a lot. This is a lot of fun that we get to do this. And every week I get to wear a different silly hat. So it's really great.
After this weekend with the pith helmet, or just before the weekend, that was brilliant. Man, I love that.
Yeah, that is. So if you're not, if you haven't been in downtown Niagara Falls in the last, I don't know, over on Saturday during the busy day, I was wearing a safari pith helmet. And the reason was part of my job is to make sure that the people that need to find me can find me. So the same outfit that I was, well, I like we're talking about this as if I wasn't wearing it on last week's show, Peter. I just remembered I was wearing it on last week's show, Peter. They know about the...
I don't remember yesterday's...
They know about the pith helmet, Peter.
Oh, no, that's... The pith helmet was awesome. By the way, Roland's with us. Roland back. Good to see you, buddy. Next week, we're booking you. Wednesday night, come here for about 6:30, and we'll make you the happiest tour guide in the world. Wait till you meet Roland, folks.
Don't make those kind of promises, Peter.
All right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. But, hey, don't you just love the stories of the beaver sharks? I mean, boy, Marty and Nick have been all over the falls talking about their appearance on beaver sharks.
That was great. Having them come and talk about the beaver sharks. I mean, the funny thing is, so if you're wondering what's behind me right now, which I'm going to lean, this is the Maid of the Mist boat dock. So this is, it's an old photo. It's from about 2 years ago when I was down on the dock. But yeah, there it is. So that part that's kind of down below to the left, that's what's called the floating dock. So what happens is that actually raises and lowers with the water level. And this is what we were talking about last week, what they have to assemble, where they have to attach the gangway to it and all of that. So that piece raises and lowers with the water level. What can happen, though, is if the water in the river gets too high, that will raise to a certain point, but the concrete pad that you can kind of see a little bit, that's what those turnstiles are heading down towards, that can go underwater. And if that happens, then it's just not safe to allow passengers. This has to do actually with the International Joint Commission and the water control dams that are built along the river upstream right before you hit the falls. Those can actually, so they have several gates on them that open and close at different times depending upon how much water they want to flow over and how much water needs to be created into a pool to be diverted for hydropower. Also, it controls the flooding along Lake Erie and the upper Niagara River. However, if there's a lot of water that's come in or they need to do testing or something, they can open those gates and flood it out. That can raise the water level very rapidly. You'll get used, and they will notify. So it's and it's not a long notification. They'll say, hey, heads up, the water level is going to go up approximately 12 feet in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And they'll let you know. They'll tell you. And they're not going to tell you how long. They're going to say in the next 10 to 15 minutes, you're going to see your water level go up. And it's going to go up exactly 12 feet, or it's going to go up 15 feet, or they will tell you how much it's going to go up by. Except they'll usually tell you in meters, and then you have to do math. But it all has to do with controlling the flow of water through the falls, controlling the flow for hydroelectric power, preventing flooding, and kind of matching it within the upper and lower Niagara rivers. We had issues in Old Fort Niagara out in that area in Olcott where they were suffering from high water for quite a few years there.
A couple of years ago, the Coast Guard dock was totally underwater.
Yeah, everything was underwater, and that had some of the argument there was the control dams need to restrict more of the water because the water is too high, and the water out, they need to get more water out of the St. Lawrence. We need to get the water out of Lake Ontario a little bit more and, control a little bit more up top and a little less down below. which led to a counter argument that said, well, if we put the dams up here on the upper Niagara, we're going to be flooding along the upper Niagara and Lake Erie, which is just as bad to these communities. So it kind of went back and forth until they finally realized that there was, a lot less flooding going on the upper Niagara River than there was in the lower. So they came to some new terms, but it is an international commission. So anytime you're dealing with this, you're dealing with two different countries that are working on a, active water treaty that the specific one that controls the dam dates back to 1950, which is before either of the current power plants were standing. So that's kind of fun.
Hey, before I'm standing, eh? Hey, Roland asked, should he wear a silly hat? So I thought I'd answer him with a silly hat. So yes,
wear a silly. Everyone should wear a silly hat.
Yes.
We are the Silly Hat Club.
Indeed, it is what is worn on our head that gives us strength. Anyway, that's really cheesy, isn't it? I know, it sounds like an ad for a hat shop in Kelowna, BC. Anyway, so without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the Welland Canal. And pipe in with what you're familiar with or because we've already talked before that you're pretty well versed on a lot of the maritime aspects here.
It is a canal. It goes through Welland at some point.
But all this started with me. Hey, you're right. In fact, it used to go to the Welland River and empty out. If you know the Welland River, it's in Chippewa, James Cameron, and it empties into the Niagara River. So smaller boats, the Welland Canal started in 1849, and that'll be in this little video montage I did. But it was built because of the falls, as was the Erie Canal, because if you could just navigate from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie without the elevation difference, you wouldn't need any canals. You would have been able to come in from the Atlantic through the St. Lawrence. And by the way, for all the tour guides out there, here's a reminder, and this goes for the conductors of the state park. The water from Lake Ontario does not travel via the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Atlantic. It travels via the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence Seaway does include the river, so it's technically not necessarily wrong. But the St. Lawrence Seaway is the entire network of shipping lanes, canals, transit passes, going from the Gaspé Peninsula, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, right up to Duluth, Minnesota. So I'm just going to run through a quick video montage with us, and we'll go from here. That's music for a silly hat. So that's the St. Lawrence Seaway. It extends from the east to west and includes all 5 of the Great Lakes. This is coming down the St. Lawrence River. Various buildings you see with castle. What's that? Now, if you look here, this is Lake Superior. I'm going to take out the music, I think. This is Duluth, Minnesota. And this is the inside of one of the ships. This is a grain carrier. Now, underneath in the hold, that's what the grain looks like when it's being dropped. And this ship is a self-unloader. So you see a traveling tunnel that goes to the back of the ship. So if you need to get from one end to the other, you can. And these are the elements of the grain elevator. And what happens is they have this nozzle. You can see it here dumping coal in Hamilton Harbor. And the nozzle takes the conveyor belt from the hold and drops all the cargo onto the shoreline where the customer needs it. And as you can see, they drop some big honking loads of coal, iron ore, rapeseed. You see a lot of powdered cement. You'll see any number of cargoes. Day and night, the seaway is open from the Atlantic. Point Cartier is where most of these boats start out. If it's an international boat, they'll transfer cargoes onto these lake freighters. Here it is coming up the Detroit River, Windsor and Detroit. And there's the whole Great Lakes. And you can imagine you can go all the way to Duluth, Minnesota, but you have to do it by canal because of this big honking thing. This is in the Welland Canal, and at the end of the show, we're going to show you a ship going through. The Welland Canal is part of the 15 locks that actually, I'll take that back just a bit, the 15 locks, and they are kind of where you see Lake Ontario in the middle above the 35 billion, the Welland Canal represents 8 locks climbing 326 feet. But there are locks up at Sault Ste. Marie, known as the Sioux Locks, and they're managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Commercial locks are there. And then further down at the St. Lawrence River, there's the Iroquois, Eisenhower, and Snell locks, and they've got some beautiful viewing areas. Also by the St. Lawrence, along the St. Lawrence River, Côte Saint Catherine and Saint Lambert locks. So from sea level to Lake Superior, it climbs 183 meters. That's as high as a 60-story building. And those ships weighing as much as 30,000 tons fully loaded are moving on from the area of the Atlantic along Highway H2O, as it's called. And this is the Welland Canal. And as you can see here, it was opened in 1829, and it was opened by a small packet schooner named the Anne and Jane that traveled the 40 locks. They were wooden locks. This picture actually represents them very well. Coming in from Lake Ontario, they would travel 40 locks that would then bend into the Welland River and take them to the upper Niagara River, and they could proceed from there further up into the Great Lakes. Now here you'll see some of the first 3 locks that were built in the 1800s, and these are still, there were 3 versions of the Welland Canal that kind of followed the meandering path. As you can see, the brickwork here, being close to 200 years old, is in pretty good shape. There's one of the bollards that you would tie your ship off to. It goes back to a golden era of St. Catharines being very successful because of the Welland Canal. Now what you see on this picture, and all these pictures, if anyone wants them, I'll send them to you. This is the long blue line in the middle is the current Welland Canal. In 1973, they built a bypass of a bend in the river just to make it shorter. But the other canals back in 1829, I believe 56 or 58, and then 1881, the canals would follow other paths that are marked out by pink broken lines. But then in 1932, the fourth canal was built between Port Weller, which is on Lake Ontario, and Lake Erie, Port Colborne. Now that's about 32 miles. It has 8 locks, and 7 of them climb the Niagara Escarpment. The escarpment is what created the falls and what the falls goes over. And the ships go up the first 7 locks, then they take about a 10-mile transit to Port Colborne, they're adjusted, and then they go into Lake Erie. So the Welland Canal is ships of all size. Back in the day, you'd see some of the Great Lakes ships of their day, passenger ships. This is the Welland Canal at night. These are all self-unloading freighters. The red ones tend to be from Canada Steamship Lines, and these black ones are from Algoma Central. There's a car ferry that crosses the path when you're going up there, and another ship from a different company. But you have a lot of lift bridges, and we'll show you a really interesting video of those lift bridges. It's something that happened in 2001. But as you can see, those locks are really tight. At the Welland Canal Center in St. Catharines, it's on Government Road right alongside the canal. You have viewing platforms, plus a museum, plus some great activities, restrooms, a snack bar, and you get to go really close to these ships and see just the size of them. I don't know if you recognize this, Nico, what that is. That's called the Plimsoll lines, and those are markations on the side. There's an explanation here, but they basically indicate the depth to which a vessel may be safely immersed with cargo. Tells you what type of water, what season, etc. And the LR with the circle and the line through it means Lloyd's Registry, which registers all ships, or has the what you say are the regulations or the standards by which ships are maintained. So you'll see those on the side of lots of ships, and here's an explanation. As I said, I'll send this video to anyone. Here's Lake Superior. We're back up north right now hitting waves. We're passing a very old freighter sitting in Port Colborne. I think that's the John Baird. And these are just, well, there's our Enterprise again. I thought I'd mention this scoring on the side of ships. One of the most fascinating things that happens on these ships is when they come into a canal lock. The locks, as I showed you, were very tight. Here's a replay of a picture I had earlier in it. there it gives you the best idea of the locks. Because they're so tight, you're trying to position this massive ship with a beam or width around 54 feet into a 56-foot tunnel. And if you go towards the gates, it's very hard to maneuver it so that a sudden wind won't push you from one side to the other and collide with the corner of the canal. So these ships use a process called walking the wall. And they actually push up against the wall going into the chamber, and that guides them in so that they don't lose control. Once they're in the lock, then they're safe. But getting in there, they usually walk the wall and press up against the side of the harbor. And I can't believe how many duplicates are in here. Anyway, these aren't duplicates. I just kind of threw these in at the end. You know these islands, don't you?
Oh, yes, I do. Those are the Thousand Islands.
Yep, and they're gorgeous. And those ships, when you're down there, you see the ships. But
yes.
They also see these sights every time they pass.
Yeah, I had dinner out in, I think it was Clayton, and they were passing right on through and off the patio.
Man, we have a place at St. Catharines that I was mentioning, the Lock 3 Viewing Center. And years ago, there was a restaurant called Freighters. And Freighters was overlooking the lock, so you could watch the ships come in, lower or raise. And I was playing there with a friend. We were a duet playing some music for a Saturday night. And a ship came in. I forget what ship it was, but it stopped because something was holding up the canal. And we started playing The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And we watched as a sailor climbed over the railing. Now, back then was pre-9/11, so you didn't have the big gates, etc., that you do now. And this sailor, he hopped over, came up to us, and asked us to stop playing it. And he asked us to stop playing Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald just because he had served on the Fitz and was actually a month off it when the accident happened. But they take it quite seriously. They don't, for the guys who serve, men and women who serve on those ships, they have a deep bond to those who lose their lives. And finally, on any ship, you got to look for this. I need a bathroom, right? There is a poop deck. There you go.
Oh, Peter.
So that was my little treatise on the St. Lawrence Seaway.
That was really great. This is really cool. And these are things that, we talk about. We've been spending a lot of time talking about the American side. I'll talk about the Erie Canal and stuff. But, remember, half of this show is things to do in Canada. And the Welland Canal is as Canadian as it gets. It's really cool.
It's a great experience. People come out with kids, and at first you think, oh, we're looking at a boat. Wait till you see the size of those boats.
They're huge. They're huge.
Yes. Here's one thing about it that I was going to share. You and I thought about including this. This is a video from August 11th, 2001, exactly 1 month before September 11th. I was coming back from a weekend with my wife's parents in the States, and as we came over the St. Catharines, the Garden City Skyway, over the canal, I noticed all these ships were laid up. And we couldn't figure out why. And when I got home, there was a news article that a ship had collided with the bridge in Allenburg. So here's one of those lift bridges. And as you can see, the bridge was lowered. The accommodation section, the bridge, and the funnel were all destroyed as it hit the bridge. So the actual story of what happened, the bridge operator was called in that day. It was a holiday Monday in August.
Sailing home.
And he was called in to operate the bridge, but he had taken prescription medications and alcohol before he came in. When the boat was halfway under, he hit the lower button, not knowing that the ship hadn't cleared. So as you can see, there's a crewman who's rushing around making sure all the airtight doors and watertight doors are closed, help prevent the spread of fire. He was commended because of his actions. He was certainly on the ball. And the ship burned in the Welland Canal for a day or so. It was filled with wheat, of all things. And she was the winddock. She was part of the Patterson line. And one of my good friends was one of their chief engineers, who's now with Lloyd's of London, Lloyd's Registry. Anyway, I had been on that ship about a month earlier, so I remembered it. But it's a 720-foot freighter. and it was carrying about 30,000 tons of wheat. And she caught fire and closed the canal for almost a week. And it was a really scary thing because when finally we learned that the alcohol and drugs were involved, it prompted the Seaway to create more automated stations run by the Seaway's central building. And that is located just near the Lock 3 facility. And I had the pleasure of touring that years ago. And they have cameras all along the Seaway. You can see everything from the Atlantic Ocean to Duluth, Minnesota. So you can go like 2,000 miles inland on the Great Lakes. And shipping is the cheapest way to move bulk products. Whether it's coal, iron ore, any type of crop, corn, anything like that, it's cheapest to move it by ship. And it moves pretty quickly. In about 4.5 days, you can go from the Atlantic to Duluth, Minnesota, or anywhere in between in less time. So that's your Welland Canal treatment.
I love that.
Roland mentions he remembers watching ships at the canal when he was a kid.
Well, that's so cool. I always like looking at them. Although I always forget my binoculars. That is my running joke. Is that every time I'm looking for boats, I've much the Titanic in me.
I know.
Where are the binoculars? I haven't seen them since Southampton. Don't know where they are. Every time I'm over at Old Fort Niagara State Park on the beach, there's always a ship coming out of the canal. And I never have my binoculars, and I can never look at the ship, and it makes me very sad. Because it's all the way over there, and I'm trying to see which one it is, but I love you can still see them because they're huge. They're absolutely ginormous.
Wow. Yep, and they put quite a silhouette on the horizon.
Oh yeah. Oh, shout out to so John is watching. Becca's watching too. Hi, Becca. Becca said hi. Shout out to I love you guys. This is like we have regulars now.
I know.
This 23 episodes in, we have regulars that watch this and go, why is he dressed like a captain? Hey, it's Wednesday.
It's Captain and Tennille impersonation time.
Oh no.
That makes me Tony Tennille. Never mind. Oh no. Oh, that would look bad. Anyway, so that was my experience with the Great Lakes. I did work for a year on the West Coast with a ferry service out there. Also had a life-threatening accident and decided the water is safer from the shore. But I love the water, and I always will. And from that, though, I noticed that when I first met you last year, you had this really cool love for the Titanic and the things related to it. So then I found this little video, and I'm going to let you narrate this one because this is a rather surprise. I did not know what you told me about this. Yeah. And I think the audience should know for sure.
Oh, absolutely. You might want to cut the audio so I can narrate, or we could just keep the lovely. So this is an actual newsreel that would have been released around 1912. So it's talking about Captain Smith, commander of the ill-fated SS Titanic. It was not the SS. It was technically the RMS Titanic, which stands for Royal Mail Steamer, as it was authorized by the Crown to carry mail. So here we see Captain Smith inspecting over on the bridge. So it's actually the overlook on the starboard side. But we see him in his summer dress whites, which was my first clue that something was up. If I wasn't already a Titanic historian, I would go, this was April. They would have been wearing closer to what I'm wearing today, which is all black. But he's wearing his dress whites, meaning that this was recorded in summer. Captain Smith was the captain of the Titanic. It was set to be his last voyage before he retired. These are the emergency telephones to be used in storm. Parts of these are accurate. Engine room signal chart. So these are pieces. This is actually what's known as a telegraph. Not to be confused with the telegraphs to Sen Marconi wireless, but they would communicate between the bridge and down below. So actually, if we rewind to that real quick and just pause, because I want to kind of explain some of that. So if you look, it says all clear starboard, let go tug, not clear starboard. It's built in Liverpool, but so this one's actually on the top of the ship. This one would have been used when they were going into port. They'd actually a lot of times bring a port master onto the ship to navigate the ship into port if it was an unfamiliar port. But these were also located in the bridge as well as down in the engine room. And how it would work is you would pull it all the way to the left, and so all the way forward and all the way back, and it would light up. It would send that little, there's like an arrow that you can see on the top, would swing over to the position of what command you were telling down to the engine room. Because while they had the steering wheel and could steer the ship to tell the ship to stop or go into reverse, you know, you wanted the engines ahead full, ahead half, you know, full astern, which means going backwards, you would have to tell the engine room, because all of the control of these, you know, reciprocating engines, Titanic had two massive sets of these reciprocating engines, which were like these piston-driven engines, as well as a turbine engine in the center. The turbine engine couldn't reverse, in fact. So when the Titanic cranked into reverse on the night of April 14th, when they called full astern and hard to starboard, which they called hard to starboard to steer port. That's an old sailing term. If you ever watch, back in the day, they would, I'm veering wildly into 10 different conversations, but I will get back, I promise. They called hard to starboard. They called hard to starboard because back in the day, in order to turn your ship to the left, to port, you had to turn the wheel right to starboard because of how the cords were attached to the rudder. By the time of Titanic, if you heard hard to starboard, you knew just to turn your wheel left towards port. It was just, it hadn't caught up with it was old sailing terminology that they didn't change yet. So they called hard to starboard, it meant turn to port. And they would send full astern, and they sent full astern, and that told the ship to go backwards. The turbine couldn't go backwards, so only the outer two propellers would turn. This is a lovely view of the first class promenade and with the lifeboats. These are the lifeboats with the famous Welland davits. The Welland davits, fun fact, actually were very sturdy but quite shaky. So being on those as they were being lowered would be quite interesting, and it's why a lot of people stayed on the ship. They felt that a 882-foot, 9-inch, 46,000 gross registered ton ship was a lot safer than a rickety wooden boat on these shaky davits. This is the inner promenade of not the Titanic. None of these are of the Titanic. That is my big plot twist, and this is the dead giveaway. This promenade did exist. It would have been open like that, but the middle portion would have been enclosed. So the Titanic had a sister ship. Technically, it had two sister ships, an older sister and a younger sister. The older sister was the RMS Olympic. All of this video is of the RMS Olympic.
Whoa.
The RMS Olympic, which has a storied history of its own and is actually my favorite ship. The RMS Olympic is my favorite ship of all time. It was the first of the three of the Olympic-class ships. The differences that you will see between the Olympic and the Titanic are subtle cosmetic changes that were made to the Titanic after the Olympic had already set sail. The Olympic set sail about a year earlier. And the Olympic was a wonderful ship. It became known as Old Reliable. But what we're seeing here is, why would we reuse footage after they said the ill-fated Titanic, and we're using footage of the Olympic? That is because there is no footage, at least not any real substantial footage, of the Titanic. There's very few photographs of the Titanic. Most interior shots that say they are of the Titanic are most likely of the Olympic. White Star Line would double dip, since they were twin ships, and send a lot of the photos of the Olympic's interiors as the Titanic. The only photos they would take that were different were photos of specific places that were only in the Titanic at the time. Things like the a la carte restaurant, the Café Parisien. I believe the Turkish baths were unique to the Titanic at the moment. A lot of these ended up going back into the Olympic because they were very successful. This is a video of the Olympic leaving, and the easiest way to tell is if you look at the upper promenade, so that upper deck section. On the Titanic, the middle of it was enclosed. On the Olympic, it was open all the way across. So if you look at the lower level, where all those big giant windows where the people are hanging out is, the Titanic's, that lower level and the one above it matched. They'd have those little windows on both levels. It would close out in the middle. And that was actually because they built out extra staterooms for the wealthy passengers to have their own private promenade, which was exclusive to the Titanic. The Olympic kept its open promenade on A deck for its entire career. But that's the easiest way to tell them apart, is if you look on the side and that top deck, that A deck promenade is just wide open the entire way down with no breaks of enclosure, it's the Olympic. If it has enclosures, then it's the Titanic. But they were sister ships, and I have a lot of Titanic advertising that it advertises it as the Olympic class liners, the Olympic and Titanic. The goal was to use those liners as a continuous service between Southampton, Cherbourg, Queenston, which is I think Corb in Ireland, and New York. And you wanted a continuous service. A lot of the people that were on the Titanic for its maiden voyage, it wasn't considered a big fanfare event. The Olympic was the big event. The Olympic was the first of the three. The Titanic was still amazing. It was the largest ship by tonnage. It was identical to the Olympic, but because of the additions, it was over 1,000 tons heavier than the Olympic, making it the bigger ship. Otherwise, they were pretty much the same size. The Britannic afterwards was even bigger. But where these stories get really interesting, and there is a Niagara Falls connection, as there always is, on the Titanic, traveling in third class was the Goodwin family. And the Goodwin family was coming to Niagara Falls, New York, as the father was going to meet his brother, as he was an electrical engineer out in England and was going to get a job at the Sholkoff plant in Niagara Falls with the Niagara Falls, for Niagara Falls Power. So he was coming to New York and Niagara Falls, New York specifically, to start a new life as working at the power plants here in Niagara. Unfortunately, and the sad part about this with a lot of people on the Titanic was most of them were not scheduled to be on the Titanic. They were scheduled to be on several other ships, most of them owned by White Star. However, there was a coal strike that had been occurring during the time period, and much as flights get canceled, all of the sailings were canceled. The only ship that was sailing at the time as we were being relieved from the coal strike was the Titanic. It was quite large. It could hold a quite heavy number of people. At the time, it was loaded with 2,200 people. But this family, the Goodwin family, was rebooked to the Titanic. It was the only boat they could get out. And so, unfortunately, they were rebooked there. They were third-class passengers, and unfortunately, they did die on the Titanic. Along with, I believe it's 1,497 is the official tally. They usually round it to 1,500, but the specific number, I think, is 1,497 number of people that lost their lives. Over 700 survived. But it's a tragic situation. And it's fascinating to see that there was such a Niagara Falls, New York connection. Is someone from Niagara Falls, New York, who loves the Titanic so much. If you go down over, and I remembered it because when I went down to the artifact exhibition in Orlando, they have, I believe it's either Mr. Goodwin's pocket watch or one of his pocketbook. They have something of his on display from the wreck site, and they tell you his story. But as I was saying, the Titanic was one of three sisters, and that video is of the Olympic. The Olympic is my favorite ship in the whole wide world, and I'm going to tell you exactly right now why. Because while the Titanic sank, and its younger sister, the Britannic, which was a hospital ship in World War I, hit a mine and also sank, the Olympic refused to sink. And when I say refused to sink, Peter, have you ever heard the stories of the RMS Olympic?
From World War I, right? I know what it was pushed into service for, but do tell.
Okay, so before we even get there, before the Titanic even set sail, the RMS Olympic was found to be quite the troublemaker in most ports. The ship was so massive, and the engines were so powerful that it would pull other ships out of their berths, off of their moorings, and make them head towards the ship. The Titanic actually almost got hit by the SS New York on its way out of Southampton, because it pulled the New York off its moorings and it almost rammed into the Titanic, getting caught in its wake. It didn't happen. It missed by a couple of feet. If that would have happened, it would have delayed the voyage, and we probably wouldn't be talking about any of this right now because the Titanic wouldn't have sunk. No! But a year before, the Olympic was sailing and collided with the HMS Hawk Are you familiar with the HMS Hawk, Peter?
Well, Her Majesty's ship, so obviously British Royal Navy.
It was a ramming ship. It is built to do one thing, ram ships.
Speed.
It rammed into the stern of the Olympic, tore a giant hole in it, kind of knocked out the motor. The front of the HMS Hawk was completely collapsed in on itself to the point where the Hawk was never able to properly perform at full function ever again. The stern of the Olympic destroyed the HMS Hawk. It did sail, but eventually the HMS Hawk was never able to really work it out. Unfortunately, the courts determined that it was the Olympic's fault. Was it the Olympic's fault? That's highly debatable. Was the court going to side with the British Royal Navy? Of course they were. So this did cause a layup of the Olympic, which also delayed the Titanic's maiden voyage, as they had to take pieces from the Titanic to rebuild the Olympic, to fix parts of the stern. But the Olympic continued its career. And was absolutely amazing, continued its great career into World War I, where it was used as a troop ship. And it is the only troop ship of World War I to have a story where it successfully sank a German U-boat using no guns. No, the Olympic is so crazy that it saw a German U-boat, a submarine, that was coming after it, and it turned and ran it via its stern and sliced the U-boat in half. So once again, now it's taken out the HMS Hawk, and it's taken out a German U-boat using its stern. Well, what about its bow, you may ask? Well, this ship lasted all the way into the 1930s, and one of its last acts before it was scrapped and decommissioned after Cunard bought White Star was, in heavy fog, to run over the Nantucket Lightship. Rammed right through it. So the Olympic became known as Old Reliable because no matter what went its way, it refused to sink. And it is absolutely, I love the Olympic. It is the first of the Three Sisters. It is not nearly as famous as the Titanic, but it is an amazing ship. All the photos you see of the Titanic, all those beautiful interiors, are also photos of the Olympic. The clock from the Olympic, the carving, Honor and Glory, Crowning Time, other than the fact that they decided to paint it cream and paint the staircase, they painted the staircase green in the 20s because I don't know what White Star was thinking. Apparently that was Art Deco and they wanted to modernize it. But yeah, they painted the staircase green. But the cream painted wood of Honor and Glory Crowning Time is in the museum in Southampton. It's actually because that portion they kept. And a lot of the woodwork, it was all sold at auction when the ship was being scrapped. And it's actually sitting in a restaurant and hotel. It's like, I think it's the Swan. It's out in England. Then it has the original woodwork from the RMS Olympic, which is really great. It's on my bucket list to head over to like Southampton and see all of this stuff. Also head over to Halifax and see the Titanic section in Halifax Cemetery. But this is a great photo. Thank you, Peter, for finding it. So there's the stern of the Olympic with its hole in it. As you can see, look, I mean, there was, and they said the damage below the waterline was much greater than the top. It put a decent dent into the propeller shaft. But that's the front of the Hawk.
The ram, it says the damage being so great that the ram has been mashed flat.
Now, can you imagine this? And can you imagine how sore the British Royal Navy was that their ship has one job to ram other ships, and it hits the Olympic and it turns into a pancake? And this is why I love these kinds of stories. There's another great story though about the Olympic, because I'm not even done. This is how insane this is. So there's a ship. And I'm gonna pull this up because it's German. Are you ready for this? It's the SS Kronprinzessin Cecily.
Gesundheit.
World War I broke out while this ship was out in the water. It was heading towards New York. It knew that as it was making its way towards New York, it was obviously going to either A, be sunk by the British, or B, be taken. All the ships that were German, that as soon as the war broke out, and they basically were seized in harbor, in New York, and once America joined the war, they were absolutely seized in harbor in New York. I think the crew of, it might have been the Bremen, actually lit their ship on fire. Like they did everything to try to make sure the Americans couldn't get it. But the Americans did get most of the ships. But this ship, the Kronprinzessin Cecily. Let's get this right.
Yeah, wunderbar. With 2 pickles, please.
Exactly. It was a 4-funnel steamer. It didn't look any, it was like this, it was a little tiny thing with 4 funnels kind of like this, spaced out unevenly. But it was heading towards New York, and they're like, uh-oh, we're in trouble. I know. Our funnels are tan. What if we paint the top of the funnel black, and they will think that we are the Olympic?
Oh.
Mind you, and I'm just going to hold up a quick photo because there's only one, but I'm literally gonna do this old school because I'm dropping this on Peter. This is the ship we are talking about. The funnels are unevenly spaced. Like, they're hoping that from far enough away you won't notice that is not the Olympic. But if you're an American or a British citizen, and this ship that also the Olympic was 882 feet long, and this ship was, and I'm looking it up right now. Are you ready for this? The length of this ship was 685 feet.
And you know that there are crewmen on all these ships holding the list, the silhouettes of every ship that's on the water.
You're in the middle of war, and that's it. They had silhouette lists, so they knew right. They're like, so it didn't work.
Hans,
the ship was immediately caught and was like, no, you are not. But I just love that they're like, well, if we pretend as for the Olympic, we'll be the pride of all of Britain, and they love us, and they won't try to take us. And it's like,
Hans, stay out of the beer.
And meanwhile, I want to say that when it was seized, so it was acquired by the U.S. in 1917, but it was interned in 1914 as soon as the war broke out. So what happened is these boats would head over to New York, and they would be docked because they couldn't go back where they were coming from. They couldn't head back to Germany. They would be sunk. So they would just sit in New York. Their crews would sit maintaining the ships, and that was the rule. They had to maintain the ships. These crews were also actively knowing that should the U.S. join on the side of the British, which is highly likely, we need to be able to sink these ships as quickly as possible in New York Harbor so the U.S. won't get a fleet. And then the British decided to, torpedo the Lusitania, which had a bunch of Americans on it. And then also send a telegram to Mexico saying, hey, we'll get your land back if you fight the Americans. So America decided you were getting involved in World War I. A lot of the German ships tried to light themselves on fire in New York Harbor, failed spectacularly because now you're dealing with the full might of the United States military, and that was not going to end well for them. So a lot of the ships in World War I, and a lot of the ships the U.S. ended up getting, including ships like the Leviathan, these giant ships that ended up becoming part of United States line, were German ships that we just took from them. The actual ship that my great-grandfather came on from Italy, the SS Barbarossa, became actually was seized by the U.S. government and turned into a warship.
Wow.
During World War I. So, there's a history, and that was because it was a Norddeutscher Lloyd line ship, North German Lloyd. And it would go from Germany to Italy out to New York, and then it was sitting in New York, and the war broke out. But these are the kind of fun stories that I like. I follow a lot of, there's ocean liner people on Titanic, on YouTube. that talk about a lot of, so I know a lot. I have an entire book on ocean liners and stuff, and there's so many cool stories about them. And even right now, the difference between a cruise ship and an ocean liner, most cruise ships nowadays do not classify as ocean liners because they are not built for transatlantic travel. They sit too high on the waterline. They have too much superstructure on them. They would tip. Also, do you know why ships were painted black? All the things like the Olympic and the Titanic and all these ships were painted black, and even some of the ones in the Welland Canal.
Okay, run it by me.
So there's two reasons. One is They would paint it black because it helps keep the ship warm when they're traveling through the North Atlantic. It saves on heating. But the real reason was because you even had a lot of ships that were painted black, even if they're traveling in the Mediterranean, and that was a little questionable. But the reason why is these were coal-powered ships. And the coaling process, in order to load these ships, involved opening chutes on the side of the ship and just sending coal in. And this was a filthy process.
That's the one I know, yeah, the bunkering of coal.
So just bunkering coal was so filthy that you could actually see it on like the HMS when the Britannic was converted into a hospital ship and painted white.
Yeah.
The side of the ship was filthy. There was just streaks of black going. Even in black and white photos, you just see these dark streaks. And it was because the ship would rapidly be covered in coal. Once these ships in the 1920s were either built or converted to diesel, you started getting ships that were painted white because you no longer had to deal with the bunkering process. And that's also where you get things like the Mauritania being painted white. And fun fact, the Olympic, when it was launched off of the out of the slip, out of dry dock, and it was launched, before they built it out, it was painted white. And the reason you paint it white is it looked impressive painted white. It looked really cool. Same with the Mauritania. They would paint it white because it looks even bigger, it looks grander, it's bright and clean, it's freshly made. But then before they'd send it out, they had to paint it black because otherwise people would be getting on this very, very dingy looking ship. And that was just, when you're trying to attract all these opulent passengers.
Oh, yeah.
You don't want your ship looking like it's, looking like Pigpen.
Nope. No, that's a very good explanation, yeah. Oh, by the way, let's take you mentioned something about that ship, the German ship being tiny, and that made me realize we talked about something today. I have a rare piece of video, since we're showing video, that Nikola Tesla, who worked with me at the state parks, played by Aaron Rath. Man, was that guy Nikola Tesla. But every once in a while, he would break out Tiny Tesla and Tiny Edison. And I found his first ever broadcast.
Good afternoon, my name is Tiny Tesla. Howdy, bud. I'm Tiny Edison. Mr. Edison, you are a very, very bad man. Oh, I don't know about that, bud. I just take what I want, baby.
I don't know why I wanted to play that, but I found it.
You want to know why? Because we were talking about Niagara Falls power, so obviously we need to tie that in.
Yes, Tiny Tesla.
That was fun.
Oh man, he did a whole bunch of them. They're on YouTube, I believe.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, they're kind of fun. He was the best at Tesla I've ever met. Certainly knew everything about his story. He understood the patents and what they represented. He knew a lot of nuance. He had put a lot of nuance into the way he portrayed Tesla. So he was a great part of the team at the what do you call it, the state parks. And I think I miss it. I played Augustus Porter, and we had Annie Taylor and Maria Spelterini and a whole bunch of others. I think I showed them one week. So it's been fun finding out about your enjoyment of ships and all things water. Kind of thinking that this Welland Canal is someplace you can go visit if you're on the Canadian side. I do have one closing story about the Welland Canal, though, that I think would be worth sharing.
Yes.
Back in the 1850s, I believe it was, the Underground Railroad was in full swing, and there were large populations in St. Catharines as well as elsewhere in Ontario of African Americans, of those who had fled slavery. And they had communities and schools and employment, and they were part of the community. It wasn't, it was very normal just to have everybody mixed together. And there were Irish and Italian. Well, there was a colored corps, it was called. It was a militia regiment that was formed. So, and it was exclusively people of color who had fled slavery. And the colored corps served with distinction in many ways and was part of the militia and the law enforcement. But during the building of one of the subsequent Welland canals, they had a strike from the Irish canal workers. The Irish were very upset with their living accommodation, their employment, their wages, etc., and worker safety. So they held a strike, which eventually led to a riot. So the only unit that could be pressed into service to confront the riot were the colored corps. And the Irish, who already held deep prejudice against people of color, now saw someone they disliked wearing the uniform of the British, who they hated. And the Irish were incensed and routed the entire regiment, just went after them as one mass crowd. And it was a very ugly and horrible affair with loss of life. But it's just part of the history of this area. The Welland Canal was a huge employer and allowed, like I said, allowed ships to bypass Niagara Falls. If you have a chance and you're going over to Canada, I really encourage you to take a few minutes and go to the Lock 3 Viewing Center. There's one at Lock 7. And all these locks are part of the escarpment, so they're pretty much within a few miles of the lakeshore. And then the canal extends down to Lake Erie. But when you realize the impact this thing has, billions of dollars, $15 billion in salaries a year are made from people working on the canal and the ships. So there's just a tremendous amount to it. So we hope you'll explore that in Canada. And in a couple of weeks, I'll do one on the Erie Canal for you that you can narrate. And we'll talk about it. By the way, something Angela said, 2 things Angela said. She talked about how the fire hydrant was invented in Lockport. And I was doing an insurance inspection at a building there, which was the old City Hall. It's where Flight of 5 Winery used to be. And down below, 3 levels down, the owner took me right down there. And there's an old fire hydrant, one of the very first made. It's just sitting there. So I thought, what a great display this would make, but only if you could find the first dog that visited it. Anyway, I don't think he got the joke. But yeah, fire hydrants in Lockport. And she was asking about the long ships travel the lakes in the summer. Angela, were you meaning the tall ships? In 1995, I narrated the tall ships tours at Toronto Harbor, and I've been at a number of them along the I participated in the one on the Welland Canal as well. The tall ships do travel through the Great Lakes, and they're worth seeing. You see every type of tall ship, sailed vessel. You see a recreation of the vessel that John Cabot, one of the first explorers of Canada, came over, and it's called the Matthew, and you're shocked. It's built to scale and it's tiny. You know, there's just so much you learn from experiencing things like this and seeing them firsthand. And we really encourage you to get out and do as much hands-on as you can, because this is a very hands-on region. Both sides. Erie Canal, the same way. You've got great exposure to the elements of the canal. And, oh, you know what? If Angela's just made a comment about they hit the Minnesota harbors, wondered if they near us. Do you mean the Viking longships? Because I know they found remnants of Viking villages up in Minnesota. So it's quite possible, because Leif Erikson was here in 1000. In fact, I toured the village in Newfoundland at a trade show. They took us by helicopter as an incentive, and we toured this restored village that the Vikings had in Newfoundland from 1000 A.D. So, yeah, I've never heard of any Viking relics or any type of archaeology discovery in this area, but it's fascinating. Tall ships and the Viking long ships she was asking about. So sorry to go off on a tangent there.
Oh, that's fine. we like these. These are when we learn even more things that are happening in the area.
Yeah, so Mr. Nico, will you take us away? Oh, and we'll play a video at the end. It's 9 minutes, almost 10 minutes long, of a ship going through the canal in fast motion. If you want to watch it, go ahead. If not, have a good night. But off to you, Nico, for the closing comments.
Well, folks, thanks again for joining us. Next week we'll be back, probably in a more Niagara Falls focused episode, but these are the episodes that we like, where we get to veer off, still talk about local history. We get to talk about the local connections to famous things like the Titanic. I mean, it was just the 111th anniversary of the sinking, so it was, you know, kind of all perfect how this lined up like this, that he wanted to talk about Welland, and he's like, why don't you talk about Titanic? I'm like, oh yeah, let's go. And I got to learn about the Welland Canal and put another thing of my to-do list this summer, which is growing increasingly long, but I'm excited for it. Makes me also want to go to the Pirate Festival now. And Angela's just reminding me, she's talking about Viking longships and things like that, and now we're talking about tall ships. I'm like, I gotta go to the Pirate Festival in Olcott this year, which we will probably be covering as it gets closer to time for that too. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For your Niagara Falls experience, I'm Nico.
I'm Peter.
Have a wonderful evening.